All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to pick back up with
You have to send a new link.
chapter
Should be able
4.
to use the one she used.
If you haven't been with us, we've done a little bit of background. If you haven't been with us at all, we started with all of Genesis, and so we're going to see some connections. But today, in fact, some of those connections, at least in some patterns, are going to come up. Last week, we closed with Moses getting his call, the story of the burning bush, the miracles that he's given to prove who he is to Pharaoh. And then we spent a bunch of time talking about the name of God, which again was probably pronounced something like Yahweh. The reason people felt uncomfortable using it, and still most of our Bibles today, even though we know how to pronounce or something like those 4 letters, YHWH, we still write Lord in all caps in our Bibles. But today we're going to look at a passage that if you have not taken the time to study Exodus closely, you probably don't know it. It's never been put in a Bible movie. It is, I mean, the Bible has all kinds of difficult passages and puzzles and enigmas. This one is my favorite. It is so, it seems bizarre, out of nature of what should fit in the story right here, but I'm going to try to make the case that it makes good sense here. Explaining why it's here, that'll be a little trickier. This was something I was actually working with a friend on, a scholar, to write kind of a history of interpretation of this passage, to try to show all the layers of understandings and meanings through time. And then we both started doing other things. So that has never been done. So I'll share some of that here. But again, a really unusual passage. So let us pick up where we left off in chapter 4. All right, let me make sure. Can everyone see the text? All right. All right, so we went through this passage of the miracles, and then now remember, God tells him, go back to Egypt now and deliver this message. So Moses goes to his father-in-law Jethro, we'll pick up in 18, even though we read this. Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt and see whether they are still living. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. The Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who were seeking your life are dead. Remember, he left where they were concerned about his killing of the Egyptian. So Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. This staff's going to get a lot of use. Now, realize here, the thing I want us to notice is that he is directly told by God, it's time to go back. All right? So he heads back, and here's what no movie maker ever wanted to deal with. Okay, actually, we talked about this paragraph as well. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I've put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. This we're going to get familiar with, this hardening the heart, and we'll talk about that later. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn. I said to you, let my son go that he may worship me, but you refuse to let him go. Now I will kill your firstborn son. That's going to be the climax of this whole contentious battle between Moses and the Pharaoh. And again, Moses is not to be shocked when Pharaoh says no, because God says, I'm hardening his heart so that I can get all my plagues out. I want to show him all the stuff I can do. All right, here's where it gets interesting. On the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord, Yahweh, met him and tried to kill him. But Zipporah, his wife, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, Truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then, she said, a bridegroom of blood by circumcision. All right, there is our puzzle. What in the world just happened? Let me jump back for a second. Are people familiar with this passage at all? All right, well, a couple people. This is not something that you get a lot of Sunday sermons on. It's a hard one to preach. This one doesn't come up in the lectionary. Moses is coming back. He's told to come back. And right before he gets back, God tries to kill him. Now, Zipporah, and again, the passage is even a little bit more obscure than it's translated because there's a lot of pronouns, a lot of he's and hims, where the translator makes it clear that it says she circumcises him. And some commentators throughout history thought she circumcised Moses. But I disagree with that. I think this translation is correct, that it makes it clear that it circumcises her son, and then does something with the foreskin, and then she says twice, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. All right, so before we dig into this, like if you're just reading along doing your early morning devotions and you hit this passage, thoughts, comments, suggestions, or do you just keep reading fast? Like block it out because I haven't had breakfast yet.
Well, so why would God try to kill him? That's what occurs to me.
Good. First question, why does God try to kill him? And I hope to show you that this isn't totally new. It feels new, but I want us to see that there's going to be a pattern here. All right, but good question number one. Why does God try to kill him? Good. Other questions pop into your head.
The name or the phrase bridegroom of blood is pretty ambiguous.
Very, very. And you can read article after article, and there is no perfect link to say, here's what we know this means or where it's from. I will give you one of my guesses. I mean, I have a suspicion. Actually, I have a couple suspicions, but we'll talk about those later. So yeah, that phrase is really obscure. Other questions or other things that become particularly puzzling?
Well, I don't know if we can go back, but the whole I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. It's like, thank you so much for setting him up. Yeah.
Yeah, we won't deal with that one today because we're going to spend a lot of time on that one later because it's just
okay.
coming up where Pharaoh seems like he's ready to give in, but then he hardens his heart to make sure. But we'll talk about that. That's a good one too.
I'm wondering about the foot. Why would she touch the foot?
Right.
Is there some significance there?
There's all kinds of hygiene issues going on here, right? But we'll talk about that because I think that's going to be idiomatic.
It's not like Moses does anything, but Zipporah does. So
Yes.
maybe this passage is more about Zipporah than it's about Moses.
Well, it is interesting from how this book started. The female person is the troubleshooter, problem solver who saves lives, right? Because whatever she does seems to assuage God's anger and makes him move on. All right, so that's another good point. It's Zipporah, it's Birdie to the rescue. Okay. Any other things that when you read this right away jump into your head like, what the heck just happened? All right, so as we see, there's lots of problems. And here's what I just want to tell you first. If you're the person, right, who watches the movie or watches the TV series, here's the perfect example. Anybody in here watch Lost? People watch the series Lost? All right. First, if you haven't, you really should, but that's neither here nor there. If you watched Lost and you were one of those people when you got so frustrated at the end when it concluded, because you said, just wait, but it didn't answer that, and that doesn't solve this, and it left you frustrated, you might want to check out of Sunday school today, because there is not one solution that's going to make all these things feel satisfactorily, right, solved. Like, oh, I get it now. That's what keeps scholars busy, though. We need some of these puzzle passages that we can keep plugging away at. No one is, has solved this puzzle perfectly. So what we will see are suggestions, impossibilities, and then the right mind at the right time, or the right archaeologist is going to discover the right text or the right thing that one day hopefully will pull all these things together and go, oh, it makes sense. But I think it's going to be a layered passage. And let me make this parallel before we move forward. For those who were in the Genesis story, remember the wrestling at the Jabbok River story, where we talked about how if you do like a folklorist reading, there are different things about like demon river gods that stop people from passing rivers, and there's the idea of how they can't be out when the sun's out, and the threat of the sun coming out, right, makes a certain level of sense to it. And then there was the aspect of face of God, which we kept going before his face, and he names the place face of God, which seems like, oh, well, he's wrestling God. That's part of the story. But then there's the problem of like, how do you wrestle God and make God say uncle and give you what you want? And then that's problematic. And then that weird thing about nobody eating the tendon on the hip because Jacob limped. And there's no recording anywhere of people not eating that aspect. But maybe at some point in ancient Israel, they didn't. And this passage explained it. Like, so there's nothing tied that up really well. But there was a really nice ending of like, oh, he's Israel now and he's got a new name, and we just push the rest of that stuff to the background and say it's good enough. It's only scholars like me who keep wrestling with it, like, that's not good enough solution, we need more. This is gonna be one of those passages. So let me point out a few things. Let's go back to the text, and let me point out some things about it first that'll make it even more maybe troubling, maybe make a little bit more sense. It'll make some sense because it'll pull in the bridegroom part. So first of all, and you see this footnote right here. If you go to the bottom, that's simply saying the text does not say and touched Moses' feet. It says it touches his feet. Okay, because here's what I think is going on. First, in the logic of the story and in the culture as we know it, there's no way Moses could not be circumcised. Because there's two reasons why, and we don't know the right answer. Moses, as a Hebrew child, may have been circumcised on the 8th day, okay? Because that's what you were supposed to do. But in light of all the strangeness around Moses' childhood and you're trying to hide him, maybe they didn't circumcise him, because if you don't want them to know it's a Hebrew kid, if he's circumcised as an infant, that's an obvious tell. Egyptians circumcised young men as a right from puberty into adulthood. So we have these, and I was going to bring one in, and I thought, again, we don't need to be too graphic before breakfast, but we have these stone reliefs in ancient Egypt with young men kneeling, hands tied behind their head, with a man in front of them circumcising them with a flint knife. This was part of a ritual into adulthood. So either as a Hebrew baby or as a Egyptian teen, Moses would have been circumcised, okay? So it seems like the son is not circumcised. So when God is about to kill them, Zipporah circumcises her son. And for people who've been in Sunday school with me a long time, I know we've mentioned in the past, in ancient Israelite idiom, euphemisms, right? We always like to clean up language. Feet is an idiom for genitalia. So there's time when it says a person's going to the bathroom, it says they cover their feet because they like drop their robe down, but talking about exposing feet, talking about genitalia. So what it seems like she does is she circumcises her son, and then she uses the bloody foreskin to bloody probably the front of Moses to make it look like he's bloodied. And then she makes the connection of bridegroom of blood. All right, so that's where the bridegroom and the marriage idiom comes in, is she probably makes the front of Moses bloody so it looks as if he's bloodied. Now, this phrase, a bridegroom of blood by circumcision, again, like I said, is nowhere. But there have been all kinds of guesses that that phrase at some point was part of a circumcision ritual, was part of a wedding ritual, was part of some kind of rite that it links back, because the fact that it's repeated, right? Truly a black bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then said, a bridegroom of blood by circumcision. That clearly is an important phrase. We just have no idea why. But it has to be connected either to a circumcision rite or to some kind of a marriage rite. Now, let me stop. Any questions about that? Because it just went from strange, maybe for you, stranger.
So Dean, in verse 28,
Yeah.
the word he, it's lowercase. I mean, there's nothing that signifies that it's that it really is the Lord, although the context is certainly that's pretty much who it has to be.
26, so he let him alone.
26, yeah, sorry.
It's either the Lord or some intermediary angelic kind of being who's doing his bidding. Yes. Any other, before we even look at this, I want to talk about the pattern, I think is really the most important to understand something about what's going on. But anything about the specifics, I think it's pretty clear that this is not putting it at his literal feet. I think it's about circumcising a son, bloodying the region of Moses's genitalia, and her making this comment about bridegroom of blood. And again, the first one doesn't mention circumcision. Truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. Which again, that has to be linked to some kind of a marital ritual. But a bridegroom of blood by circumcision, linking those two important life passages is fascinating. So let me share something else with you. And this is where I started looking to bring some kind of a new way of thinking about this story. So two things converge here for me that actually, when I thought about this story in light of my research, I actually had this weird, like, oh, this story fits and makes sense. So I want to share with you my thinking around that, just to give a context. You may get to the end and go, okay, this doesn't make me feel any better about anything, but at least I want to show you a certain structural parallel that might help. So first, I'm going to mention somebody that you've probably never heard mentioned in church before, but his name's Victor Turner. Has anybody heard of Victor Turner, the anthropologist? So Victor Turner is a very famous anthropologist who did his work on rite of passage. French scholar, looking at rite of passage rituals and the way those function in societies. And those, again, we all have rites of passage in every culture, right? They're They're ways we mark significant changes and shifts. Victor Turner works specifically on ritual behaviors, patterns, and structures in traditional cultures. Most of his work was with the Ndembu tribe in West Africa. And so I spent a lot of my time in graduate school reading fascinating African rituals as I was trying to find a key to understanding tricksters better. So here's what I will tell you. Victor Turner says that rite of passage rituals, when they are, we call all kinds of things rituals that aren't really rituals, they're just events. But if you have true rituals that play out an event, he says there's 3 parts to it. All right. There's a tripartite pattern that he demonstrates over and over and over. And I'll talk through the pattern and then I'll show examples of how he saw this. He says, first, there's often this idea of that they left their home or they left the normal structure, crossed boundaries. There's some kind of departure in this pattern. The second part is that the person ends up in an area of wilderness or in the margin. And this is not just that they're doing it physically going to the margin, but somehow their person, their status, their standing goes to a margin. And within this marginalized place, there is danger and threat. Because when you leave the normal place, you're in the wilderness. You're in the place where the rules don't apply. You're in the place where the normal societal structures, that civilization, you leave it behind. It's the Wild West. And Turner comes up with this whole category of liminality. If he did a lot of his work got applied in the 60s and 70s to alternative cultures, the hippies, that this was liminal space. And limen is just Latin for threshold. So there's this idea of once you cross this threshold out of the normal structures of home and society, that all rules are off. And so clear delineation of up, down, gender, rules and structures all come apart. Again, it's the Wild West. It's this place that is out of the normal world into this place. But in this liminal place, in losing the normal structures, losing societal's standards and rules, in losing the categories, it's dangerous, but also somehow like spiritually powerful. It is seen as this really interesting mix. And again, I didn't want to go on this, but I did all kinds of work around liminality and relating it to trickster stories. In this space of danger and power, there is a transformation that begins so that in the end, when the person leaves that marginal place and returns home, they are somehow changed with a raised status. So the person who began the journey, who ends up in the marginal liminal space, comes home a different person, changed, elevated. Okay, so let me give you the most famous rite of passage that Turner talks about in the Ndembu. Like the ancient Egyptians, they had a circumcision ritual that happened that signaled the shift from childhood and boyhood into manhood. And when a young man became the right age, and there would always be a group, there'd be a cohort of them, the men, the warriors, right, the soldiers of the tribe, they would take them out of the village and they would leave. And again, if you were a typical person and if you were a woman, you had no idea what happened now because you were crossing the threshold, going into the wilderness, out into the marginal space of danger, threat, and liminality, and something would happen there. And Turner talks about the kinds of experiences, challenges, the kinds of behaviors that would happen out there where everything was different and status breaks down. In some of them, they would have these situations where they would like dance and dance and dance until they were to the point of exhaustion and ready to collapse. And then at that point, they would be circumcised. There's different competition, all kinds of things happen in that space. But no one's allowed to talk about it. It's secret and it's hidden. Then the ritual is performed. The boys are given time to heal. They come back home and they come back dressed differently. They come back with their weapon. They're no longer children. They are now men. And when they come back in this situation, the kind of behaviors of what boys could do and the kind of games they'd play and that they hung around with the women in the home and all those, that's gone. They're different now. They are considered men in the community. All right. So there's this three-part status. Victor Turner, when he looks at different rituals in all kinds of cultures, he says there's certain aspects of those that we all carry with us. Let me give you a simple one. This idea of, and there's like a list of like 15, 20 things. He says these are things that happen in the liminal marginal space. And a big one is like there's no gender. Like gender rules break down. One of the things he says is if you think from the beginning of time till now, he said when Christians baptize, whether you're baptizing infants or adults, everyone wears the same unisex white gown. There's this certain commonality in that. Again, and I don't want to spend the whole day talking about ritual studies, but here's the point. This pattern that Turner talks about, I think certain texts that certain texts follow this same basic pattern of home, wilderness, return home. And one of the things I argued in my research was that in the Bible, trickster stories fit this same pattern. So think back to Genesis in our work there. Every single one of the wife-sister narratives where the patriarch lies about who his wife is, they're at home, they always leave and go to a foreign place. There's the threat of death, assimilation, or destruction by the foreign ruler. So the lie, the trick is told. There's a potential conflict there. But then in the end, every one of them returns home with all kinds of wealth and raised status. Every single time. The person who's the best example of the trickster is Jacob, right? Jacob leaves home under threat of death. He has all kinds of things going on, right, in the liminal space where he's tricking, getting tricked. He's in this constant battle of wits with Laban. He finally gets the best scam of all, where he gets all of his herds, all of his stuff, and then he flees. But what happens to Jacob on his trip back? And remember, the Lord told him to go back. But what happens? When he's about to cross the river to come back home, he gets attacked by God. God attacks Jacob and wrestles with him at the river. We didn't really ask the question why, but it fits this pattern of the threat of returning. And in the end, think about the raised status. Jacob comes home now as Israel, the one who wrestles with God and man and overcomes. Okay? Moses is fitting this exact same pattern. Moses within Egypt, leaves home. Egypt has become his home. He goes out into this wilderness place, encounters God. He gets a raised status in that he's told, you will be God to Pharaoh and Aaron will be your prophet. But like Jacob, on his return home, he is threatened. His very life is threatened. It actually fits the pattern. Now, let me take it on a macro level. Israel as a people in the Pentateuch, the whole Pentateuch pattern is this same tripartite pattern. The patriarchs live in the land of Canaan. They end up having to leave into Egypt, right? The whole story of the end of Genesis through Deuteronomy is about them being in the wilderness outside the land. But when they encounter God in the wilderness, there is the threat at the Mount Sinai and numerous times that God says he's going to kill all the people and wipe them out. They survived that threat, but again, they are going to return home with raised status as they take conquest of the land. And one more layer to this. Think of the macro story of the Hebrew Bible as a whole. It's the story of Israel in the land, the threat of Israel going into the wilderness of exile with the threat of destruction and assimilation. You talk about living in the margins, but then the idea of the return home that's going to happen after the exile with the prophetic promise that, talk about raised status. They say, this is the place that all peoples of the world are going to flow to, and Jerusalem is going to become the center of the universe. I think this pattern is that we're seeing right here with Moses is actually repeated over and over and over. And the reason I bring all this up is for my own work. The place where the trickster lives is in the wilderness, in the margins. The trickster is not at home in any land, but he lives in the margins and he weaves in and out back and forth. And so again, my overall study says the reason Israel and its patriarchs see themselves as tricksters is because they are the liminal entity who lives in that space. Let me give you an ancient Israelite parallel to this. Think about the story of the high priest. Now, again, the home and raised status, all that is very figuratively mentioned, but just this three-part pattern. Think about the high priest who goes into the liminal space of the Holy of Holies once a year, who goes into a place where there is ultimate sense of danger by the overwhelming, powerful presence of God in that place, right? In that in-between place, that liminal space, but then comes out again as the holiest priest of all, the high priest. This pattern can be seen in ritual all around the world, but I think this pattern is continually reused in Israelite texts about its story. So I know that's a lot, but on a micro level now, think about what's just happened to Moses. He leaves Egypt. He dwells literally in wilderness in Midian. And on his return back, he has a threat that almost takes his life. So on that level, when you see that broader pattern, it's probably not as much of a shock, like, well, that came out of nowhere. On the surface, it came out of nowhere, but if you see that pattern, you go, well, that's actually the pattern Israel's going to experience over and over again. So let me stop and say, any questions about that? That's a lot. And you will not hear that in a Sunday school class anywhere else in the world. So,
Dean, if we look at that tripartite pattern, and I could pretty easily fit Jesus into that, if I do that, would you view Jesus as a trickster?
there's a fair amount of writing about Jesus and the disciples as trickster. Because it's that, I believe that the Bible portrays the Israelites like a priest, because the priest lives in that in-between marginal space, that liminal space of power, which is why I argue the tricksters fit. But if you look at the entire picture, you could even say of Christian theology, right? We live right now in the liminal space of now but not yet of God's kingdom. We're between the great kingdom of the past and the kingdom coming in full that the picture of Revelation and the prophets talk about. And so in light of that, they look at these stories. In fact, and this goes back to some of the church fathers, and C.S. Lewis plays with this. All right, so think about C.S. Lewis in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's a trick of Aslan giving himself up as the sacrifice to redeem the kids, because he knows about the deeper magic that he would come back to life. And so Lewis is flirting with this very thing. And some have said that Jesus' death is this trick where the enemy, the Satan, the devil, thinks he wins. Great, I'll do this. I get him and I bring him down to the underworld. But Easter then becomes like a punchline. It's like, haha, you didn't know this was going to happen. Because he wouldn't have, again, in that kind of a narrative that the early church fathers talk about, that sees the Jesus story as he has to pay a price for sin and he becomes the payment. It's the shocker of all shockers that he comes back. And so, again, we live out that story every year and we don't see it as a surprise. It's our expected. But yes, there's plenty of stuff that sees Jesus in this vein as a trickster. Here's the caveat. I will also acknowledge, as someone who's done like 85% of my scholarly work around tricksters, I do get the phenomenon, if you're a hammer, all the world's a nail. So, you can all look at it and kind of give me a side glance and go, okay, great. But I definitely see that as a possible reading. And within Latin American culture, then Latin American Christianity, Peter plays the role of trickster. And there are these great, in Mexico and other places, these traditions around Peter, where he's the one who, knows how to do that to keep everybody out of trouble. Yeah. So again, I think this gives some understanding to the overall structure of the happening and a why, but not in a way that maybe still feels satisfying for a reader of a religious text. But it's on a literary, folklorist, anthropological level. You're like, wow, that's really interesting. Can I throw in one more thing that might make it, it makes me smile, but it might make it even a little stickier, or should we just move on? There is one story that some Egyptologists write about that's really interesting, and I don't want to make too much out of this. But there is a story in Egyptian folklore of a goddess who gets so angry with the people that she wants to slaughter all of them. And there is another deity who thinks, okay, this isn't good. So basically takes, and if I recall the story exactly right, it's river water that she dyes red and tells all the people to lay on the ground and pours it on their bodies. So it's like the old ketchup trick. So they all look like they're like a bloody mess and they've been slaughtered. And when the deity sees all the people laying on the ground bloodied, the deity says, like, oh my gosh, I can't do this thing. And it like assuages their anger And through that great trick, all the people live. Because they say, okay, I can't do this very thing. I just have this fascinating moment where there's feels like a parallel to this, where, and again, that has all kinds of implications. So I want to be really careful here that I'm not making any theological statements here. But there is this sense where it's like, once Yahweh sees blood over Moses, blood on the kid, was like, all right, I'm good, and backs out. And I want to add one more thing here, which, again, if it's bothersome, just block it out of your mind and pretend you never heard it. But in light of this trickster stuff, I've been really fascinated by the Passover story, right? Because Yahweh doesn't go door to door killing people. Yahweh sends his avenger, right? The avenging angel of death goes door to door. I've been intrigued once I started again, and I will acknowledge the hammer and nail metaphor. But once you start seeing things, sometimes you see, it gives you a new lens to look. Think about the Passover image, about blood on the doorposts. I've wondered, is that supposed to, in an ancient Israelite's mind, we've always read that as, oh, that's code, that the avenging angel comes to the door and says, oh, that's one of the good guys. I'm going to leave that house alone, right? Like that's the way we've always processed that. That was the code, right? That was the do not disturb. But there is part of me that wonders if it's not a ritualizing of putting blood on the sides of it, like the bloody massacre coming out of the door. And all of a sudden, when he's going through the neighborhood, it's like police tape, right? You already see blood on the doorway, like, oh yeah, we already got that place. Let's move to the next one. Are they passing over because they go, oh, there's blood on the door, that must be a Hebrew house? Or is it blood on the door that for the, it's like the crazy goon going house to house. He goes, oh, we're good, we were already there. I don't know. I got too far into trickster stuff today, but I told you when we get to the end of this, nobody's going to go, oh, great, I totally got it, and I feel better about everything. But it gives you some really good things to think about, or maybe really terrible things to think about, but it does give you stuff to think about. And maybe I should, maybe this YouTube video should be hidden. But anyway, we'll talk. I'll run it by Pastor Jody and see if she wants it in the series, or it'll be like the tapes that drop out of the class. Any comments or questions about, I'm promising you now, if today turned your stomach, this is as bad as it gets in Exodus. It gets back on the movie train after this. Comments, questions?
I'm just intrigued as to, like in the placement of all of these encounters with the Lord and whatever. It's like, right at the river, or right as he's ready to go back to Egypt. It's like the final test.
Yeah.
This is it. It never happens at the beginning. It doesn't, there's no plot development from there. It's always, this is the end, and then we move on.
Right. It because you're crossing a boundary. It's the crossing that threshold, the limit, which, okay, as we end on the 28th, the last day of Black History Month, right? In African American slave culture and history, the idea of jumping the broom, right? You know this with marriage rituals, that's a symbolic crossing a threshold. The broom becomes a boundary marker. And when you jump across it, you've crossed a threshold. When you cross rivers, that's a boundary marker. It's a threshold. You're going from one reality to the other. We've talked about this before, right? This creepy ancient Near Eastern idea that's been that we have in our subconscious psyche, but we've dressed it up. The idea that baby snatching demons live under the threshold of our doors, our front doors. That goes back to ancient Israel, it's ancient Europe, and it's why the husband carries his bride across the threshold. It sounds sweet and romantic. It's not letting her expose her genitalia to the limit, to the threshold. That's where the root of that is. It seems sweet and romantic, but that's not where it comes from. And when I was in Ukraine once, visiting my sister who was teaching there, the principal of the school was standing in his office. I was just outside his office, and I reached out my hand to shake his hand, and he stepped back. He said, "Oh, you don't shake hands across the threshold. Please come into the room." Like, we have these taboos around boundaries. Okay, and so that's what we're seeing. That's why it's crossing the river. That's why it says he's about to come back. It's going to be when the Israelites, you talk about threat and danger, when in Joshua, when they're ready to come back into the land, the angel of the Lord gets upset because nobody'd been circumcising. And what do? It says they circumcise all the people, and it says that's why that place to this day isn't called Gibeah Ha'alot. It's called the heap of foreskins. Because, I mean, there's threat and danger, right? Right before you enter in. But listen, those stories parallel. They forgot to be circumcising. They forgot to be circumcising in the wilderness. So they all had to get circumcised before they came into the land. Well, isn't this story then the precursor to that? The story of Moses coming back into the land and he forgot to circumcise? It's parallel. And when Ezra, after exile, brings all the people back, I want a circumcision story there so badly, but there's not. But what does it say they do? They hadn't been reading the law and they'd forgotten to celebrate Passover. So they celebrated this great Passover. But I mean, it's just like below the surface. I know it's there. It's this same idea. It's about the upside down, don't follow the rules, tricksters reign in the marginal space. And before you come back in, you have to get oneself back to the people as they're supposed to be. So circumcision, Passover, right? Reading the law in Ezra. We just don't get the circumcision one. I think all these stories are stacked in a certain structural way. All right, I'll stop talking about this.
Dean, you just said, I think, that Moses forgot to be circumcised, but earlier you gave two
Oh, his
instances.
kid. Yeah, not Moses, his kid.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think because she circumcises the child. And again, it's interesting because as an Egyptian, he wouldn't have had to have been yet, but going back to be the representative of the Hebrews, right? It should have happened on the 8th day. Yeah, so it was like a forgetting of parental duty. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'm thinking about these rites of passages. We usually affiliate them with ancient rites or maybe even third world country rites, and even our country, Native Americans. But there's something in us to say, well, what about us? What are our rights? Have we lost this? Are we not part of that progression? And I think there are rights, but they're not quite as scheduled or regulated as they were at one time. And the ones I think of right away are going in, like we pray for the kids, going into the military, going into college, or even confirmation, which is a sort of a religious
huge one.
rite of passage, which unfortunately has been taken by a lot of our youth to mean graduation.
Yeah.
And not continuation. But it seems like we're a little short on rites of passages and consider them archaic and maybe in the past. Maybe the rest of you guys have a comment on that.
Let me say one thing about that though, because here's something I love about Trinity. If you think about this pattern, right, and the idea of this liminal space, like we won't call it the margin, but the liminal space, this idea, like in Eastern Orthodox tradition, right, that's the place behind the icons where nobody but the priest and the altar boy go, right? And that's blocked off from us. We don't have that in Lutheranism. But up around the altar is that powerful liminal space. And it's raised, right? Think about all of our most important rituals. The communion elements are blessed at the altar, right? The confirmation students, when they are formally, right, crossing that boundary, where are they blessed? At the altar. We're given the communion elements on the floor, but what do? We walk up to the altar to pray. When we have the baptism of an infant in the white robe, they don't do it on the floor, right? They come up and it happens at the altar. And so there is this idea that we do have that liminal space. But like, here's the great flip of the whole thing, which again, this is like, it gets me choked up. It's so powerful. We have this idea of the power of the altar. But the most important thing that is central to us as believers, Lutheran believers, is the gospel. And the gospel comes from the altar and then comes down to the people. We don't always do that anymore, but that's a powerful aspect of this thing on high, this thing in liminal space, this thing in the place of holiness and danger comes down to the people to be read. That's the counter ritual that says Jesus comes down, and that this thing that is unattainable, unreachable, is dangerous, this too close. I always use that language with students, is that ancient Israel and the high priest and all these are the too close for comfort relationships with the divine. You can't see God and live. It's a danger if you get too close. It's dangerous to go into the Holy of Holies. It's dangerous, right? To remember the guy who tries to stop the poor schmuck who the Ark of the Covenant is about to fall. He does his good, spiritual duty to like right it, and he gets zapped and he dies, right? Doesn't matter. That's the power of the liminal space. So that's the picture of God. And then all of a sudden, Jesus comes and walks around with people and hangs out with people that shouldn't be anywhere near the divine. That's the power of gospel message. Maybe that's our kerygma to end today. In the midst of too close for comfort, overwhelming power of the divine that always has the potential to destroy, and rightfully so, because Aslan is not a tame lion, but he's good. But God at any point has the right to do anything because God is God. But we still believe he's good. And how do we know he's good? Because that great line in John's Gospel, first chapter, that the Logos who was with God and was God, he came down, and the literal word is he tabernacled, he tented among us. He became the tabernacle where Moses ends up going in, and he's going to be able to encounter God face to face, and his face shines because of it. Jesus comes in flesh. And it says, no, at the end of John's prologue in verse 14, it says, no one could see God, but we beheld his glory, right? And that's the power of the incarnation. maybe that's a good place to stop before I go into more weird stuff. That is where, right? Luther, all things lead back to the gospel. Comments, questions, objections, counterpositions. I'm glad we ended with the gospel part. It would be like, so be careful out there, everybody.
Just want to thank you, Dean. That was all very thought-provoking, that there's a breadth to this story that kind of ties together to an even deeper level than we might have imagined the different parts of the scripture with all the things you were talking about, the tripartite nature of these rites. And just thank you. Thank you for going into that. No objection.
My pleasure. Only at Trinity Sunday School do people talk about Victor Turner in Sunday school.
And I think this belongs on the web.
Okay.
Absolutely.
We Jesused it up enough at the end. It's okay.
You know,
Definitely. Mhm.
All right. Any other last thoughts before we close in prayer? My wife's in the background saying this is what she has to deal with on a regular basis. So you guys have the opportunity to tune out at any time. She lives with this.
Oh, no, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, let's pray. God, you are good. You are faithful to us. God, you call us.
Mhm.
God, help us to see that even in your call, that there is challenge, even in your, there is mystery, even in doing your work, there's difficulty and struggle. But help us to see that that does not mean that you are without a plan, that we are without purpose, that all is lost. But that you are continually hearing the cry of your people. You are continually calling your people to restore, to redeem, to reconcile. So God, help us this day to be the gospel lived out. Help us reflect the incarnation of God coming down in flesh. Help us be the church embodied. So God, we give you this day, we give you this week. Be with us in this difficult time in our church and in our land. Help us be salt, help us be light. Help us know that we are your people and you are our God. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen.
man.
Amen.
All right. Have a great week, everybody. We'll try to get back on our 3-chapter a week pace.
Thank
This
you.
was a great lesson.
It was.
Yeah.
And maybe one day, if I get my greatest dream, somebody's going to make an Exodus movie and put this story in it. Or maybe somebody will just make a movie short of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
So any movie makers out there, spread the word.
Yeah.
All right. See you, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Dean.
Have a good week.
Everybody have a good week.
Yeah.